Hello, beautiful people. I am here. I'm going to keep it short. I'm not using my whiteboard, it's over there. I'm going to just stand before you as I began these lectures. I've grown a beard and cut my hair, and there's still a bed frame over there. But I'm taking it out, I swear. uh, didn't want to mess with the setting while, the show was in production. Just want to keep it the same. The books on the coffee table moved around, and the guitar case gets opened and closed. I have a few concluding thoughts, but mostly I just want to thank you for, as they say on reality TV, taking this journey that lasts 16 weeks and that for some reason human beings still think has something to do with their future prosperity and enlightenment in the present. I think it does, but I think a lot of people teaching in academia today are doing more harm than good, but that's another story. We'll discuss a few passages in this great book tonight, Possible Profession. And let's start by just talking about the midterm questions. So I asked you to, or not midterm, what was it? Final exam, haha. They're optional, but they're interesting. So, and they help us review, I think, some of the major things that go on. There's 3 for each book. So we'll talk about these 3 having to do with Dora. Dora, if you don't remember, is this early patient of Freud's. She comes to see him for about 3 months in 1900 in the fall, and then she leaves the analysis abruptly, basically breaks it off and hurts his feelings. That January. Freud writes it up right away, but he doesn't publish it for 5 years. And it has the key discovery, which is the second question of transference, where Freud recognizes that Dora's feelings for him were not merely about her father, and this is why the analysis breaks off, according to Freud, they're about her father's mistress's husband and family friend, this messy situation she's entangled in with all these older people who should know better, but of course they don't. RK is in love with Dora. Dora's feeling the way she feels about him towards Freud. That is, she's sort of tempted by it, but ultimately kind of pissed at him, and she ends it the way she ended it with RK. And then, and then the third question for the book is dreams, okay? So in that, there's a lot going on in these questions. The first one, if we just read it, Freud argues that Dora's historical symptoms are all have their origin in sexual ideas, fantasies, or experiences. Identify one of her symptoms and say how Freud explains its origin in sexuality. Second, do you agree with this reading of her symptoms, and why or why not? I'm not going to tell you the answer, but I will tell you that this is a thesis with Freud, is that any symptom you're experiencing that has no physical cause, that's mental, according to Freud, the origin of it is in an unfulfilled sexual wish. That part of why it's unfulfilled is that your moral mind says it's bad, and your mind represses it. And then for Freud, when you repress something, it doesn't go away, it just comes back transformed. And the old thesis, the motto is the repressed returns. The repressed returns, and it returns as a symptom. So, for example, Dora's stomach pains are a symptom of childbirth, pregnancy, the fantasy of wanting to have RK's kid is this symptom, okay? The coughing, the pain in the throat and all this sort of stuff, the constantly fidgeting with her fingers and her hands and her hair and stuff. all this stuff relates to like masturbation or the fantasy of like oral sex with either her dad or with Frau K, Erke's wife, who Dora is really the first of all those people that are kind of involved with her desire. The first of them that she really like connects to is Frau K. Okay, so it's just a point that you want to keep in mind is that Freud sees the symptom as being explained in relation to a wish about sex that's been repressed and now has emerged. The repression isn't final, it isn't successful, the repressed idea, the repressed wish emerges as a symptom, as a cough, as a fixation on someone like her dad or whatever that he sees as falling backwards. Okay, transfers and countertransfers, you can define those, you can do it. And I already even said, if you go back a little bit, what the countertransference. The countertransference for Dora is, the transference to Dora is to Freud. And then it's interesting, it's more speculative, it's not really discussed directly, so it's more your argument who is Freud's countertransference towards, to describe it towards Dora. You could talk about her name, the name that he gives her. It's not her real name. What does that name refer to? Who does it refer to? Okay, and then dreams. So again, going back to wishes, talking about transference. Dreams are the fulfillment of wishes, sexual wishes, unconscious wishes, wishes from long ago in your life that you don't remember consciously that arrive in the night while you're sleeping. And dreams, again, to read question 3, dreams describe the wishes that occur in one or both of Dora's dreams. How do details of the dream factor in the identifying the wish for Freud? Mention any sexual symbolism he sees. Also mention the transposition reversals in the dream content and the underlying thought. So, well, how do I'm not going to answer all that, but it's just reread the dreams and reread the analysis. Read especially closely the beginning. You can pick just one. I didn't say do both. The first dream, I'm trying to think of which one would be easier to talk about for you without giving away the answer. But, basically both these wishes are, one is to go backwards into the comfort of the attachment to her father. Her dad rescues her and sort of chooses her over her mom in the first dream, where she dreams that there's a fire and her dad takes her out of the house. There's a reversal there having to do with the fire and what that's reversed into in the analysis. You can probably guess, although I'm not going to say. And then in the second dream, the wish is not. Her dad dies in the second dream. She goes to his funeral, so it's to overcome. It's this wish of overcoming that. That's very Oedipal. That if you remember the Oedipus complex is one where a young kid is fantasizing about falling in love, having sexual fantasies to the extent kids can have them about one parent, and seeing the other as a rival. In the classic case of Oedipus, he unwittingly kills his father and marries his mother. So, with that in mind, sorry, I'm reading the text. With that in mind, the fact that she shows up at her dad's funeral shows you this sort of contrast in the two wishes. One to go back, one to go forward, to find someone else, to not fall into this trap of being, trapped in a childhood sexual scenario. Okay? All right, now, the 3 questions having to do with Malcolm, and hopefully this can get into the text. I just want to read a couple short passages and have this video be not too long. The training analyst, Janet Malcolm's interview subject, Aaron Green, aspires to become a training analyst at the New York Psychoanalytic Institute. Define what a training analyst is, and then identify the metaphor he uses to describe the desire to become an analyst. What do you think of his comparison? Is insightful, ridiculous, a bit of all? I'm not going to tell. If you don't know what it is, it's a great one, but it speaks to the what I was just talking. A hint would be to say it has something to do with the Oedipus complex. Okay, it's related to that, and you know, what does a training analyst do? Well, the name is self-explanatory to some extent, but you need to put it into sentences in the form of a paragraph. This whole thing could take you 6 paragraphs or as much as 12. I want you to be pretty direct and just straightforward. I don't want you writing, impressionistic, throughout history kind of paragraphs at the beginning of each answer. Just answer the damn question quickly and simply. Because it's a lot of material, and I'm asking you really to boil it down, which is what, as a critic, reading Freud should be helping you do. It's like Freud can cut through things and just be like, well, this is about sex, or this is about your mother. He can reduce things down to their essence really beautifully, as much as he then becomes unsatisfied and complicates things. It's always been maybe the blessing and the curse of psychoanalysis that it's fairly reductive. That it all goes back to the Oedipus complex, for example, as Green states so eloquently, and we'll look at that part of the book. Okay, question 5. Malcolm at one point gives an interpretation of Dora. Who does Malcolm compare Dora to? If her comparison is correct, describe how important she thinks Dora is for understanding Freud's ideas. On a related note, is Malcolm right to suggest that Freud's idea of transference is the most difficult of his ideas to accept? Why or why not? Again, you'd have to compare that to some other ideas. You might talk about just the unconscious in general. You might talk about his notion that children have all these sexual desires that are located in different parts of the body besides the genitals, and different forms of attachment besides, sexual coitus. And then finally, and it's a really specific part of the book. I'm not going to tell you, but it's about halfway through, where she kind of takes Freud on him bringing up, mentioning that, oh yeah, the name Dora comes from my sister's governess, who had the same name as his sister, so when she came to work for them, took the name Dora. And Malcolm says that's not quite it. There's something else there, and there's not a lot of basis in what Freud said for what Malcolm then theorizes, but it's pretty compelling what she has to say. All right, and then 6, describe briefly how Freud's treatment of Dora ended. Then compare this with the ending of Malcolm's encounters with Green. Which ending do you believe is more satisfying? Again, just comparing, Dora breaks it off with Freud abruptly without giving him warning, although she's already planned it. It's different they're not analyst and patient, they're journalist and subject. And it's clearly a different scenario, but at the same time, there are parallels. Analysis is its own thing. It's a relatively new form of human relationship, but it's similar to other forms. The whole title of this book, Impossible Profession, Freud connects it by calling it that. And he doesn't mean like impossible, you can't do it. He's saying you can't do it in a way that's ultimately, in a simple sense, satisfying. The results will always be unsatisfying, and that's really what this question at the end is about, is how do you end things? And again, he compares it to other things you have some familiarity with, even if you've never, practiced them yourself. Governing people, governance, politics, and education. And you've been the subject of both. You've been educated and you've been governed, hopefully, not just ruled over constantly by authorities. Although we've all dealt with that too, even in your education, and definitely if you had any unpleasant encounters with the police and the authorities, you've been ruled and not governed in those cases. Um, so, the journal, and I made that connection before, that the journalist and the analyst are similar in that they listen, and the patient or the subject being interviewed do the talking. And the great sort of conceit of this book is that, haha, she's gotten, you know, one of these people who listens and has this peculiar job, she's gotten him to talk. And so she's kind of been like his analyst. Okay? She's been and that he had sort of transference to her. And she had one to him too. I mean, they get along, and for all her skepticism about the enterprise, she's pretty fair-minded and pretty. You can tell she thinks there's something to all this, even as crazy as it sounds sometimes. The things he's talking about, and the analogies he makes, her doubts about them. At the end of the day, she is. I mean, she wrote another book about this, so. And I guess one other difference is, the journalists, whereas the psychoanalysis is there to help the patient, the journalist isn't necessarily, and you know, and that's a famous argument that she makes in another book called The Journalist and the Murderer, that journalism is morally indefensible in the sense that the journalist takes the subject and has to make it into a story, which to some degree involves, exploiting the person they're looking at, whether they turn out to be honest or not. And I don't necessarily buy that. It's very fatalistic. I don't even think she buys it, but it's a famous idea because it's a very extreme idea. But then, just in terms of let's just look at a couple passages now before we end. In terms of does the analyst actually help the patient? Yes, they're trained doctors, especially American psychoanalysts are all medical doctors, so they've taken that oath. But there's such a thing as malpractice, right, in medicine, where the doctors are human, they can mess up a surgery or whatever, but not intentionally anyway, for the most part, are they messing things up. And I guess, Green even makes this comparison of a surgeon to an analyst. You're not going into the body, you're going into the mind, and you're not trying to shift things around physically, but you're trying to shift things around psychically through what he calls insight. And that insight isn't just learning something about yourself, it's supposed to actually change something about yourself. It may not change your behavior. Hopefully it does if the behavior is harmful to you. But he does think that the change that the insight brings about is equivalent in terms of its significance to what a surgery would be like. And if you've ever had surgery or know someone who has, you know how painful it can be, especially the recovery and everything. So in any case, let's just look at Freud describing how it is that you go about helping them. And just to return to one last idea from, basically the debate in the field, the dichotomy is like, are you classical Freudian or are you sort of liberal reformed? And the liberal reformed analyst is warmer, nicer, friendlier, kinder person outwardly. They think that there's not just this relationship of where you're opaque and cold and trying to solicit transferences, that is, get the patient feeling things about you and then deal with that. They think that there's more to it than that. There's a real human relationship there and all this stuff. There's non-transferential parts of analysis that are significant, and that you have to actually be nicer to them than Freud imagined, and so on. And she goes very far in the end of the book. She's talking about how one of Freud's proteges, Ferenczi, and these patients who supposedly have problems that predate the Oedipal period from 2.5 to 6. These patients that you know their their problems date from much younger. They need childhood again. So Ferenczi was like literally taking people around them on vacation and basically acting like a parent. Grown ass people, like treating them like they were kids. Anyways, uh, oh man, it's funny shit. But the so just to that so that and last week I was talking about Stone versus Brenner. That Stone is one of these famous liberals who's like, no, be nice to them. Answer their questions. Don't just say, well, how does that make you feel? That sort of thing. Uh, you know, and then Brenner represents and Green, the analyst she's meeting with, her patient, quote unquote, in all this. The subject of the book, the main character in this nonfiction novel, we call this kind of book. It's a couple magazine articles that kind of feel like a short novel, but they're not made up, they're true. He sides with Brenner. Green sides with Brenner. He prefers to think of himself as a classical Freudian. He kind of shakes his head at these people that you could call object relations people who think the period prior to the Oedipus complex, around 2.5 to 6, is this period that so many patients need. They don't need you to be like the mother who's like, okay, stop breastfeeding, go, start growing up. They need someone to actually do that nurturing stuff of a very young kid. But anyways, it's a funny thing to read here, Freud discussing some of this stuff, and really Freud here. I'll get to in a second. Freud has this funny answer when basically being asked, "Are you trying to help the patient?" And Freud says, "Maybe, but that's not the primary goal." So then, what is the primary goal? And the answer will surprise you, maybe, but also shouldn't surprise you. It's a little bit not the first thing you think of when you think of a doctor and a patient, but it's always there to some extent. I'm on page 138, and then we'll look at another passage towards the end. It's just a beautiful discussion of a short story. When Aaron told me about the patient he had failed with who. When Aaron told me about the patient he had failed with who was false, I immediately thought of Winnicott. And Winnicott's one of these object relations, these sort of critics of Freud that seek to be nicer and kinder and gentler towards the patient. Freud thought you're supposed to suffer in analysis. The transferences are not nice. If you love the analyst, you're gonna get your heart broken. If you hate them, you're gonna. That's not nice either to experience that. I immediately thought of Winnicott's false self-diagnoses and asked him whether his concept might not have been useful to him in that case. But Aaron had merely remarked irritably, "There's no doubt I handled the case badly," and looked bored with my description of Winnicott's procedures. He seemed content to leave his own case in the condition of incomprehensibility and muddle. Later, another passage in Walder's Basic Theory helped me understand and place Aaron's glum incuriosity about the alternatives to classical technique, even in the case of therapeutic failures. It so happened, and this is this passage, I'm on 139, it so happens that the therapeutic variations of the classical setting usually make it much more difficult to learn more about the patient. Whatever their therapeutic merits may be, they are scientifically sterile. The real difference between orthodox and liberal analysis is therefore not that former cling to tradition while the latter are open to innovation, but rather that liberals seem to assume that all problems are already fundamentally solved, so that the structure of a case can, at least in its outlines, be understood in a relatively short time. And all that remains is the task of influencing a condition already properly understood. While the orthodox analyst looks upon a new case as a new enigma that will yield its secrets only very slowly and hardly ever entirely. In short, the orthodox analyst stands more in awe of the unconscious. He is, so to say, less at ease in Zion. Zion being, the Holy Land. Wilder is upholding the paradoxical view, and that paradox means a contradiction, like war is peace or love is hate, these contradictory statements that have some not literal truth, but higher truth, insight, really. War is peace, and to the extent that if you have nuclear weapons as a country, no one's going to fuck with you. You can be at peace if you have the world's most monstrous weapons. Uh, Walther is upholding the paradoxical view of psychoanalysis that Freud, after making his initial discoveries, adopted and maintained throughout his life, and that Ferenczi was the first to challenge, namely, that the ability of psychoanalysis to alleviate human suffering is contingent upon its being conducted strictly as a scientific experiment. The less the analyst tries to help the patient, the more likely it is that he will do so. In other words, if you're pursuing the patient's problems not as their problems that they need to be cured of, but as problems that are of general interest for advancing scientific knowledge of the human mind, then you're working on that level rather than just trying to ameliorate and help and nurse them along, you're more likely to help them. Again, I'll read what she says again. The less the analyst tries to help the patient, the more likely he is to do so. That is, the more likely it is that he will do so. That is, and you saw that with Freud and Dora. It's like at some points, it's like, is this guy is not being very nice. He's not being helpful. He's not being compassionate and understanding. He's being kind of like cruel almost, like unsympathetic. Like, well, if you liked Eric K, why'd you run away from him at the lake there? Like, he's trying to experience it as the unique enigma rather than as one of a series of givens already in place. In a symposium on therapeutic results held in 1848, Phyllis Greenacre restated the paradox thus. Freud emphasized, I'm at the bottom of 139, that his own interest in the truth. In his case, his original thesis, interest in the living pathology of the patient, was the greatest therapeutic safeguard to the patient. It seems to be so simply true as to be elusive, that the worker whose goal is the essential verity, that is truthfulness, of his scientific work may in some instances take unnecessary detours of exploration, but by and large will contribute most of the science and to his patient. So in other words, each time a patient and an analyst meet, it's not like a regular doctor, it's like a scientist and a research subject. It's like a scientist and an experiment that's being run in the manner in which Freud conducted the experiments. Okay, and some people have questions about that and problems, and you see them kind of getting into all this stuff here that I was just mentioning, the question of empathy and the analyst and all this stuff, and really how this gets resolved is that, at the end of this book, basically, after dealing with this contradiction of, okay, on the one hand, the classical, the cold, the neutral, the clinical, the scientific analysts advancing the science, and as a side effect of that, helping the patient, versus the liberal reformists seeking to bolster the ego of the patient against the, forces of the unconscious, mostly rooted in the id, the instinct, animal desires, and the superego, our sense of guilt that can be so overwhelming and irrational. Feeling guilty when we don't even think that the ego has to be bolstered, and that the analyst has to nurture it and protect and comfort the ego. Okay? At the end of the day, she comes down to just, look, it's basically the same thing. It's a difference of degree and not kind. It's all still psychoanalysis, and she really starts to, in a wonderful way, give him the last the last word in all this, and it's a great. There's a couple great points. I'll read a couple nice parts here at the end, and maybe go another 10, 15 minutes. I'm on 145 now, and this is one you see. Uh, you see here Malcolm's real genius as a writer for kind of distilling and summarizing stuff. She does something very difficult here. She sums up a story by Anton Chekhov called The Lady with a Lapdog. Famous Anton Chekhov wrote plays and stories, end of the 19th, turn of the 20th century, Russian writer. The Seagull, the Cherry Blossom, is that the name of that play? I forget. I used to teach these plays and now I don't even remember them. And then his stories are really great though, and this is one of the better ones. And you see in here the stories about basically a couple who they have an affair, and then only after they've had the affair do they kind of realize that they're in love with each other, and then they seek each other out again, and you kind of leave them there where she's young, he's older, he's cynical, and he's like 40, and he's like, oh my God, I'm actually in love. Like, I never thought this would happen to me. It's a great story, very moving story. And you can kind of see the point she's going to make, which is that, is this the kind of thing that people need that marriage doesn't supply? That excitement, that illicit desire, the secretiveness of it all. Can't we just always be who we want to be, and not have to be someone else, have this sort of differentiation between public and private? But then there's also a suggestion here of the older guy and the young woman. When they start to discuss the story, the analyst makes that connection of that's the analyst and the patient, that the analyst has seen it all before, and the patient hasn't had these experiences, hasn't had this transference, hasn't gone back into it, and so on. And that really what happens in the story is sort of it's in a way a story about the relationship between the patient and the analyst, and an analyst who ends up catching feelings for the patient, who has the countertransference that we discussed Freud having for Dora. So if you just look at this part on page 145, it's this beautiful summary of the story. Malcolm does a fabulous job of summarizing the story. And then there's a discussion of it. And you can see the story kind of functions for her. This little anecdote of the distilling the short story sort of functions for the two of them as patient and analyst, the way dreams would function for Freud with his patients as journalist and subject. Discussing the story gets at all these wider dimensions of their own experience with life and love and being a professional psychoanalyst. So 145. One Wednesday, Aaron and I talked about Chekhov's story, Lady with Lapdog. Its hero, Gurov, a cynical and bitter womanizer. Womanizes the guy who serially cheats on his wife. Married to a woman he secretly detests and contemptuous of all women. During a summer vacation in Yalta, drifts into yet another affair with a pretty and innocent young woman who is also unhappily married. The vacation ends. Gurov sees the woman off at the train station and says goodbye to her. However, forever as he thinks, and returns to Moscow. He resumes his life of joyless work and dissipation, but gradually finds, to his surprise, that unlike the other women he had amused himself with, this one is not faded from memory, but has become an ever stronger and more vivid presence for him. He cannot get her out of his head. He's in love. He doesn't even know what it is yet, but he's caught it. He's caught the feelings, as the kids say. And finally, in December, he gets on a train and goes to look for her in the small provincial town where she lives with her weakling of a husband. He finds her and learns that she too has been longing for him. They actually, he kind of confronts her at the opera and scares the living shit out of her. It's a great, great story. He finds her and learns that she too has been longing for him. The story ends a few months later in a hotel room in Moscow where she comes every few months telling her husband she has seen a specialist. On the way to the hotel, Gurov reflects on the double life he's leading and ponders the paradox that everything that was important, interesting, essential, everything that he about which he, and this is a quote from the story, about which he was sincere and did not deceive himself, everything that made up the quintessence of his life went on in secret. Well, everything that was a lie, everything that was merely the husk in which he himself, in which he had hid himself to conceal the truth, like his work at the bank, for instance, his discussions at the club, he's a bourgeois, sort of, his ideas of the lower breed, his going to the anniversary function of his life, all that happened in the sight of all was a lie. During the bleak, tender meeting in the hotel room, Gurov catches sight of himself in the mirror. He realizes that it was only now that his hair was beginning to gray that he had fallen in love properly, in good earnest, for the first time in life. Then comes this unforgettable passage. And you see how, you understand when I was having you write summaries and quote the text and so on, and make the summary serve a larger discussion of ideas? I'm asking you to do this kind of thing. The stuff of criticism. Sum it up and then exploit it to make your point. He and Anna Sergeyevna loved each other as people who are very dear and near, as man and wife or close friends love each other. They could not help feeling that fate itself had intended them for one another, and they were unable to understand why he should have a wife and she a husband. They were like two migrating birds, male and female, who had been caught and forced to live in separate cages. They had forgiven each other the way they had been ashamed of in the past, and forgave each other everything in their present, and felt that this love of theirs had changed them both. Aaron, this is now back to her talking about top of 147. Aaron and I had been talking about the difference between case histories and literature, and I said of Chekhov's story that it illustrated something that case histories don't allow for, namely the profound effect that people can have on each other, the fateful difference that a meeting between two people can make on the impact of on the outcome of their lives. But maybe literature lies, I added. Maybe literature doesn't, Aaron said. It doesn't happen. It could happen in life as it happened in the story. But the clinician would have to ask himself, well, has this man really changed? Or has he merely found a slightly different solution to his problem? That is, to have love only on the condition that is temporary, intermittent, full of deception, outside of marriage, which is a neurotic solution. That is, he's unhappy in his marriage, and he's not ending it. He's just created a symptom. He's created an affair as a sort of symptom. His marriage is legitimate, above board, constant, while his love is secret, illicit, occasional, can't be public, can't be shared. I had to agree, but tell me, when you read the story, weren't you moved by it? Yes, I was moved by it. And then he starts, again, he does this great thing. He's the guy she found a great subject. I mean, he's a brilliant guy. He's funny, too. This is like him at his funniest here. Very self-effacing, self-deprecating, making fun of himself. It's really funny here. But when you're an analyst, come on, you gotta have a sense of humor with that shit. Yes, I was moved by it. What time is it? Okay, I'm doing okay. Yes, I was moved by it. And when a patient tells me a story, I'm moved by it. What Chekhov wrote about is hardly unusual. The analytic situation is full of case histories of moral masochism, cases of men or women who cannot establish relationships with men or women that are in any way satisfying, acted out by getting involved with people who are already married, whom they can see only rarely, and whose lives consequently are chronically unsatisfying. This is essentially the story of Chekhov's hero. And put it this way, it isn't all that interesting, and certainly not touching. But Chekhov went deeper into his hero. He got his particular unique, idiosyncratic story, and it soon became interesting and touching. There's an important detail in the story. In Yalta, after they make love for the first time, the woman weeps with shame for her fall from virtue, and the man sits down at the table and callously cuts himself a slice of watermelon and eats it. Again, that's the sort of parallel you could draw between, that having an affair, going to analysis is sort of like having an affair on your husband or your lover or whatever, that it's like this secretive thing that they don't discuss and you don't have to discuss with anyone. And then you're going through all this shit, like freaking out, having transferences, crying, whatever, and the analyst is just sitting there eating watermelon, like, when do I get paid, son? It is absolutely idiosyncratic, banal, and metaphorically perfect action. It's the same thing with patients. Their stories are so full of such arrestingly rich details, as if a gifted writer, um, where was I? As if a gifted writer had composed them. When you do analysis and get people's particular stories, they stop being cases of this fixation and of that developmental arrest. They become real people. What first attracted me to psychoanalysis was the power and elegance, and yes, even the reductionism of the theory. That is, that you could all go back to your mother and your father and your early childhood years, and then the critics of Freud within analysis that come after and that have a new opinion. All they're saying is really it goes back even further than 2 to 6. It goes back to being a little tiny helpless baby. The reduction theory. But the longer, so at first he liked that you could all reduce it all to this few simple things. But the longer I do analysis, the less I can generalize. And the more I become impressed with the idiosyncrasy, that is the strangeness of everybody, of human experience, even of my own. I used to make all kinds of defensive generalizations about myself. It has taken me quite some time to actually find myself a uniquely interesting person. We both laughed at this. And Aaron added, and I love that when I love that answer I get from students at the, you do these corny icebreakers at the beginning of the semester, mostly selfishly because I need to kind of put faces with names, and if I know some detail about you, it helps. But he'll ask students to say, what's something interesting about yourself? And people will be like, nothing. He's one of those people, or he was. He both laughed at this, and Aaron added, Freud, by the way, said just the opposite of himself. He said that as he grew older, he found himself less interesting. In one of his letters to Jung, he said, one learns little by little to renounce one's personality. Okay. And, they have this wonderful conversation that continues and that goes back to the story, but you see the problem that they're hitting at, hopefully, that you can't, when you can't get what you want, which happens to us all, it can cause a lot of problems if you don't accept it and move on. If you try to get what you want with some sort of substitute, that essentially becomes a symptom. And there's one great later analyst who's mentioned briefly at the beginning of this, Jacques Lacan. He said, at some certain point, you're not trying to, you're running an experiment to discover the symptoms, but not to rid the patient of them, not to cure them, but you're not trying to help the patient. You're trying to practice the science of the human mind by which you discover things about this one that's in front of you. And when symptoms are fully conscious and fully aware, if the patient embraces them, then good for them. Now they at least understand where they come from and what they mean. Okay, and then do they have to change? I don't know. If it's alcoholism and I don't know, cutting your wrists and stuff, yeah, you probably should if you want to keep living. But whoever said you had to keep living, eventually we all have to sort of stop with it. And then I'll read. How am I doing on time? Okay, I should stop in a couple minutes. I'll read the whole end here is just about how does an analysis end. And again, it ends as the book suggests as being impossible. It ends, typically the ending's unsatisfying. Most patients don't consciously kind of come to a concluding session like the last day of school. And Freud called it the school of suffering. They run out of money, they move away, it's inconclusive what happens. Aaron Green says He's been practicing analysis, you know, 7, 8 years. He hasn't even gotten to a patient where there was like a proper conscious ending to the analysis. And she's going to make the analogy with their ending, their sort of unique. She calls it an encounter. It's not. It's somewhere in between the two situations: the situation of patient and therapist, and the situation of journalist and subject. He's like all of those things. He's a bit of the analyst, of course. That's why she's interviewing. He's a bit of the patient, and as both, he's what you would call in journalism a subject. The topic, the person she's going to discuss in the story she's writing, and conversely, she's both a journalist and to some extent an analyst here. And they get to this very funny part where he keeps going back to this one patient he had for years, 7 years, and who broke it off with him. And this is like his Dora that he always thinks about and is pissed about. And, he has the countertransference. And it all came down to this issue of fees. So let's read this part, and you'll see him kind of just bust on her a little bit when she becomes incredulous with some of his terminology, because psychoanalysis is a weird thing, right? We had debated this incident many times before. This is when he broke it off with this one patient. This is sort of like his Dora. We debated this incident many times before, and I had always taken the patient's side. Although Aaron was formally entitled to the money for the missed appointments in July, it seemed to me that he would have done better morally and strategically to be less obdurate, that is, less stubborn. The choice was his. By this time, she was a private patient paying regular fees rather than the treatment center patient. Aaron agreed that he may not have acted prudently, that is, wisely, patiently and so on. He acknowledged that his perennial problem about fees, his desire for money, and his anger toward the patient may have caused him to act precipitately. That is, he let his counter-transferences, his outside influences that she was bringing up, get the better. But he said, the real issue was not the money itself, and my real blunder wasn't that I charged her for the missed sessions. My blunder was that I didn't understand or interpret the transfer soon enough. It's exactly like Dora and Freud. Freud doesn't see that it's not that she doesn't see her dad in Freud. She sees Air K, and that's what he's saying here. He didn't get the transferences soon enough. Sorry. I didn't point out to her that she was taking flight because she couldn't face her painful feeling of love towards me. I didn't convince her that the money she wouldn't part with was the phallus child she wanted from me. The phallus child. The money's like, a metaphorically this thing that she's giving him the way a woman gives a man a child, okay? And in Freudian theory, in the Orthodox view, the child is the woman's phallus. It's the woman's penis. It's there. It comes out of their vagina. It's sort of like a phallic object. It becomes their, I don't know, center of their life. I'm sound sexist or something now, but Freud was pretty fucking sexist. Center of their life, the way a man's penis is the center of his to some extent. Okay. Before I could protest this outlandish rationalization, Aaron leaned forward intently and said in a new tone, "I know what you're going to say. I can see the derision. You're going to mock me on my face. And what is happening here is something that never ceases to amaze me. Other analysts have commented on it. My analyst has commented on it. Namely, that the insights of psychoanalysis are never taken for granted from one generation to the next. Each generation has to make the original discoveries afresh. You can't just say that Freud discovered something and now it will be taught and transmitted as accepted knowledge. the way the findings of physics and biology and chemistry are transmitted. That doesn't happen in psychoanalysis. This boggles my mind. Why can't the next generation accept what Freud found out? Because you're challenging me, thinking. Intelligent people like you challenge what Freud found out. Why not challenge the theory of natural selection? What you're challenging, of course, is the centrality of the infantile sexuality and of the Oedipus complex in adult psychic life. That's what you're challenging, and that's what thinking people, intelligent people challenge. Konrad Lorenz noticed that if you walk in front of a little chick at a certain time in the chick's life, he'll follow you, and if you do it at other times, he won't. There's a particular time when he gets set. We have found out in psychoanalysis that in human development too, there's a time that is uniquely formative, and the layman doesn't know this. He can't be told it a million times. He can't read about it in so many books. He can't even believe it, and he doesn't know, and he can even believe it, and he still doesn't know it. As right at this moment, with your very intelligent skepticism, don't know it. I'm not criticizing you. There's something very good about this talk. You're an educated person living in the second half of the 20th century, and you don't know that the Oedipal period, roughly 3.5 to 6 years, is like Lorenz's standing in front of the chick. It's the most formative, significant, molding experience of human life. It's the source of all subsequent adult behaviors. If you take a person's adult life, his love, his works, his hobbies, and his ambitions, they all point to the Oedipus complex. That's a fantastic thing to say, and we have found this out. Freud discovered it, and we used it as our touchstone day in and day out. But what we take for granted, the lay public continues to challenge. The idea is hard to accept, sure, because you know what it says? It says, as Freud said, and this is what I started the whole discussion of Freud with, so it's nice to bring it up at the end, that man isn't the master of his own house. The way the earth isn't the center of the universe, you're not the master of your own mind. That he is determined, that his degree of freedom is zero, that he cannot change his destiny, that he is malleable at one formidable time, that everything in his life is settled and preordained ever after. Yes, it's a horrible idea to have to accept, and we analysts take it for common knowledge. And when we talk about ourselves, it's a basic assumption derived from a tremendous amount of evidence. I said, when you speak of this patient's wish for a phallus child from you, and of her refusal to admit her love for you, are you talking about unconscious ideas? Yes. When she quit, she was conscious of getting her pound of flesh from me, and for charging for the missed sessions. What she was unconscious of was that I was really the center of her life, the most valued, the most cherished, the most beloved person. She couldn't acknowledge that to herself. It was too painful. She couldn't stand it. And when you stop to think about it, very few people can stand it. How does it feel? And this is the tragedy of every child. How does it feel for a little girl to find that the most important person in her life, the person she loves most passionately and loves in a particular way, namely that she wants him to give her a phallus child, is not going to do it? No matter what she does and however she tries to maneuver him, he's still not going to do it. And this is this great thing where they get in a back and forth, and they're very rare in the whole text. And the wish is reactivated, and the attempt is repeated analysis. It can't help but be, and it would be a bad analysis if it wasn't. And the two analysts who were stripped of their honors, they did it. Yes, they did it. They bungled the operation. Tell me, what do you think of the surgery analogy now, he asked, recalling our old debate. Why do you like the analogy so much? I countered. She hits him like an analyst. When he asks, she refuses to answer and forces him to answer. She's great. She's brilliant here. Because it's so radical, he says, because it indicates how impersonal intimate analysis is. Because it tells you that it is not a casual procedure, that it is serious and dangerous, that it is dire. So you feel that something is done on the analytic patient the way an operation is performed on a surgical patient, yes. And yet the goal of the analysis insight, yes. How do you reconcile the two images, the anesthetized patient on the table to whom something is being done and the person actively and consciously gaining insight? Easily, because the achievement of insight is as deep and radical and complex a procedure as the cutting out of the tumor. Insight isn't superficial. It isn't simply something mildly interesting about yourself. It is becoming yourself. It is becoming yourself through insight. And that's, can we really change? I think Freud's answer is yes and no. And how do you synthesize that? Yes and no. Yes, you can change. No, you can't. Well, you can afterwards, to a great extent, understand what it was you were doing before. The owl of Minerva, the owl of wisdom, takes flight at twilight. After the day is done, you reflect and you can understand. And from that reflection, you know, maybe, just maybe, you can change. Anyways, I'm gonna stop because it's almost 7:30 and I gotta jump on this call with that no one's gonna be on, or maybe a few will be on, and we'll talk for a few minutes. Um, but I've enjoyed this class, even despite, or maybe because I don't have to even see y'all anymore, and I've become normally I'm the analyst, kind of probing for questions. Lately, I've been the patient, just sitting in my house, confessing everything I know and the limits clearly where I don't about this wonderful subject of literary studies and the art and the task of being a critic. And we've discussed some of the great ones. Freud, one of my favorites, Marx, Charles Rosen, Stephen Jay Gould. I've tried to hit you with the cream of the crop, the all-star team, Walter Benjamin, Byron, Balzac. I mean, come on now. But at the end of the day, it was just a taste, just a sample. And if I have one wish, it's that all of you will email me in a year asking me for some recommendations of something to read. Anyways, I'll talk to you later, and it's been real.